second.
Good afternoon. How's everyone doing? Good. Was anyone else at spring fling? Yeah, I think I'm still riding that sugar high. There was a lot of candy going around. So thanks everyone for coming. If I don't already know you, my name's Hannah Moody-Gu. I'm the Director of Library Services here at PCC. And I'm really excited to welcome you to the second collaboration that we have had with Professor Thomas Mattarocci about the Titanic. So we started this last year, people loved it. So now we're saying April is Titanic month at the PCC Library. After Professor Mattarocci's presentation, just so you all know, we're going to have lots of food available. I've heard the empanadas are coming right out of the oven, so don't leave before that, okay? Wait till after the presentation, but then we'll have all kinds of goodies for you to enjoy. We will also have our book club discussion. So if you are one of our very brave readers that decided to read The Unsinkable Vampire with us by Kristin King, we will have a chance to chat about that. I know Professor Mattarocci has a lot of questions about what happened. Where did that sarcophagi go? So that'll be a really good time as well. Also, please don't forget that we have our Titanic exhibit to go along with this. So in the PCC library, all the way through May 10th, we have different items on display from Professor Mattarocci's personal collection that are replicas of items that people used and especially used for entertainment on the Titanic. This was back before the days of, entertainment captains, comedians, gigantic water slides. So what did people do to entertain themselves? So that'll be available anytime the PCC library is open until May 10th. And before we begin, I'd like to express gratitude to those who have made this event and all our other Titanic events possible. So I'd like to thank Don Wrights and our work study students at the PCC library, quite a few who are here in the audience as well. Thank you also to Jill Young and Brenda Perkins from Peak Conference Services, Lee Truen from the Center of New Media with their crew as well. Amy Matthews, Aaron Herger, and Charlie Hurley all helped us with the marketing department. We have that great picture, if you've seen it, on our posters of the Titanic sinking. It's very dramatic. So thanks to Charlie for that. And thank you last of all to you all for joining us in all of our Titanic themed events this April. Finally, of course, I want to thank Professor Mattarocci for lending his expertise, the items in his personal collection, all of that to create some really fun events. Yeah, let's give everyone a round of applause. So I will go ahead and introduce Professor Mattarocci now and let him take it. So he is an English professor here at PCC, and today he's going to enlighten us with his great knowledge about the Titanic, specifically focusing on the supernatural and paranormal elements within the history and pop culture. So again, please join me in extending a warm welcome to Professor Mattarocci as he presents Titanic and the supernatural.
Thank you. All right. So what we're going to do today is we're going to explore not necessarily the ship itself, but sort of the cultural artifact that has become the ship. So one of the things that I like about studying Titanic is there are two Titanics. Actually, there's three if you make certain arguments. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. There's the physical Titanic itself, and there is also the representative character, the symbolic, iconic Titanic that we have kind of transformed into this symbol in essence. So because it's been transformed into a symbol, we get some of the most bizarre and random things in this process. We get Titanic and pornography, we get Titanic and the supernatural, we get Titanic and economics. And so what we're going to explore today is one of these bizarre little sub-branches, and this is the paranormal and the supernatural as it relates to Titanic. We'll start big and go historical. We're going to fit this in its historic time frame, and we're going to talk about the spiritualist movement. Is anyone familiar with spiritualism? A little bit. All right, that's fine. And then we're going to talk about cultural reinterpretations of Titanic through the lens of spiritualism. So let's start with some basic historic background. By the time the Titanic sinks, the spiritualist movement has become a massive thing in Edwardian society. It starts out very humbly. So in New York in 1848, we have this incident with the Fox family. Their daughters, Kate and Maggie, are tormented by knocking in the walls of their house. And the family really doesn't know what to do with this. And so they kind of keep it quiet for a while. But the knocking continues and continues and gets more and more aggressive and abrasive. And eventually, one of the neighbors catches wind of this. And she goes over to the Fox house in the middle of the night one night to see what's going on. And she witnesses this knocking within the walls. And eventually she starts asking it questions. Who are you? What do you want? Knock once for yes, knock twice for no. And over the course of a series of sessions, they come to learn that the knocking is coming from a former owner within the house itself, who was killed by a burglar, and his corpse was buried in the basement. Or at least this is what they hash out with the knocking, in essence. So the family's attempts to keep all of this secret just completely falls apart. Other neighbors catch wind of it. The small community that they live in starts to hear about it. And before they know it, 300 people have shown up to their house. Yes, it's fun. 300 people have shown up to their house, and they want to know what is buried in the basement. They excavate the basement, and they find hair and fragments of bones, but no bodies. According to accounts, after they do this, the knocking becomes even more violent. It starts to torment the daughters even more, and in an effort to save themselves and their family, the Fox parents separate the two. They send them to relatives where the knocking continues at the houses there. By this point, it has gained national news, and all of the United States is obsessed with what is going on with the Fox family. There's investigations that are occurring. Psychologists are called in to do diagnostics on this, and the world becomes obsessed with the supernatural. And this is what kickstarts the spiritualist movement in the United States as it floods into Europe. So by the middle of the 1800s, most middle-class Victorians are obsessed with ghosts. They love seances. One of the most popular things with Victorian middle-class women is to have a seance at night, to call their friends over, have a seance, and have them commune with the dead. Mediums become celebrities in this process. Helen Duncan rises to international fame because she is able to produce ectoplasm during seances. She will conduct a seance, and in the middle of the seance, ectoplasm will begin to pour out of her mouth. We later will find out through investigations that most of this was fabricated. Before most of the sessions, she would swallow chunks of cheesecloth and toilet tissue, and then regurgitate them up in the middle of the seance to produce the ectoplasm. It's gross. It's super gross. You didn't know you were getting yourself into this, did you? We see the rise of spiritualist camps throughout Europe and the United States. We see the rise of publications like the Progressive Thinker, which are magazines devoted to just talking about spiritualist encounters. We see table turning, table tilting, which are seances where people will put their hands on the table and ask the spirits to turn and tilt and upturn the table. We start to see the rise of spirit photography. People become obsessed with photographing the dead in this process. And so by the time that Titanic sinks, the spiritualist movement has just completely consumed Victorian and Edwardian society. They loved the supernatural. They thought it was fascinating. Kind of similar to what's going on today. Ghost adventures, all of that stuff. The Victorians and the Edwardians would have gone bananas for what we do now. And it was hotly debated in this process as well, too. Some of the most well-known thinkers and creators loved the spiritualist movement. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Who's that? Sherlock Holmes, yes. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle fell in love with the spiritualist movement. He loved seances. He loved the idea of communicating with the dead. And you oftentimes see a lot of seances in the Sherlock Holmes mysteries. Henry James, on the other hand, thought this was a complete bullshit. And the reason that he thought of this was for two reasons. One, he thought of it logistically. It didn't make any sense. And the second reason that he hated it was because his father and his brother were very well-known spiritualists. And usually when you have angsty brothers, one hates what the other one does. So Henry James used a lot of his stories to tear down the spiritualist movement. Most of the ghost stories that he wrote question whether or not ghosts even exist to begin with. His most well-known one, A Turn of the Screw, calls a lot of that into question. Is the house really haunted, or is it a governess who is tormented by her own psyche? So by the time the Titanic sinks, all of this is just huge pop culture. Let's talk about how this is related to Titanic, because while this is going on historically, there's actually one of spiritualism's most well-known and well-respected mediums on Titanic. He had been in Europe on vacation, and he was sailing back on the ship to his home. This is William Thomas Stead. And so William Thomas Stead started out as a journalist, and he started out as the mud rakers who would call into question all of the horrible things that are going on in society at the time. He's writing exposés about the meatpacking industry. He's writing exposés about the poor. He's writing exposés about child prostitution. And he eventually gets turned on to spiritualism. And he slowly starts to commune with the dead, and he has a spirit guide who he calls Julia. He founds the Borderland magazine, which is a way for other spiritualists to communicate their experiences with the other side. And he establishes what is known as Julia's Bureau, which is a safe haven for mediums to commune with the other side. He is a big name in the realm of spiritualism by the beginning of the 1900s. And he's sailing back on Titanic to go home. So this is Stead right here. On the night of the sinking, his daughter and a group of his psychic friends are in Julia's bureau conducting a seance. And according to them, in the middle of the night, shortly after midnight, they receive a message from Stead. He talks about how he is dying, how the ship is sinking, and he tells them, everything I told you about the other side is true. To this day, it's debated. Did this actually occur, or did Stead's daughter and his friends fabricate the entire thing as a means to reinforce his standing as a spiritualist? For a while, the supernatural and Titanic really don't connect beyond just Stead himself. The next thing that we see when it comes to the supernatural and Titanic has to do with Edith Wharton. Edith Wharton is a very well-known female author. She's written everything from Ethan Frome to The Age of Innocence. And in 1935, she writes a short story called The Looking Glass. And she uses the looking glass to call into question the actual ethics of spiritualism itself. The entire plot to this short story is a corrupt medium who poses as a fortune teller, learns that the wealthy widow in this town's husband died on Titanic, and uses that as a means to coax her out of her fortune. And Wharton uses this as a means to call into question whether or not the entire spiritualist movement itself was just garbage in this process, and people playing on the beliefs and vulnerabilities of other people. So for a while, this is all we get. But after World War II, we slowly start to see a trickling in of spiritualism, the supernatural, and Titanic even further. And we see this with cartoons and comic books, especially for little kids. Strange Journey and Weird Mysteries are kind of your equivalent of the Tales from the Crypt comic books that you see in the 1950s. And they use the sinking of Titanic and this whole supernatural element to weave their stories. In 1958, we have a little comic strip within Strange Journey that talks about how the entire voyage is preordained. Everything from Titanic's near collision with New York to Californians' refusal to come pick up survivors is all preordained by fate because everyone on the ship must pass away. In 1972, we see a very similar story where fate tells us the fictitious story of Gary Baldwin. Gary Baldwin and his parents are traveling back to America on Titanic, and the parents sink with the ship, but Gary survives. And over the course of his life, Gary keeps encountering a whole bunch of misfortunes, all associated with water, that nearly take his life. Sound like Final Destination? Yes, it's very similar to it. And eventually he does die in a boating accident on April 15th, 1951, which, if we know our Titanic history, what's significant about the 15th of April? That's the day Titanic sinks. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Ooh, right. The interesting thing about this story is it's loosely based off of what happened to another first-class passenger who was actually on board the ship itself. So Douglas Speeden was a first-class passenger. He was 6 years old during the sinking. His father passed away, but his mother survived. And his mother ended up writing a short little children's book for him that she gave to him as a Christmas present, as a means to not only deal with the tragedy herself, but deal with it for him. Sadly, he ends up passing away at the age of 9. He's one of the first people to die in a car accident in the United States. And his story is the loose base for what happens in our Gary story. So for a while, this is pretty much all that we get when it comes to the supernatural with Titanic, but things are going to explode with the centenary. So in 2012, we have the 100th anniversary of Titanic, and things start to get very, very weird. And that's what we're going to look at now, is how weird things start to become. So start with ghosts first, because we talked about the spiritualist movement. Spiritualism was extremely fond of the supernatural. So let's talk about what starts to emerge in the centenary. We have everything from children's books down to Tubi original movies, all dealing with ghosts and Titanic. Our first one is pretty mild. This is a children's book written by a former elementary school teacher, and it is the story of a 12-year-old boy and his family who inherits a house from a mysterious individual who has willed it to them. And as he's in this house, he is haunted by these dreams of people dying and drowning within the water. And he slowly starts to piece things together. I guess before I even go in this far, how are we with spoiler alerts? Are we okay with this? All right. So I will give you spoilers on a lot of these. So if you have been warned, spoiler alert. He slowly begins to realize that the person who willed them this house was one of the crew members on the Mackie Bennett, which was a ship hired by the White Star Line to pick up the dead after the sinking itself. And because he became in close contact with the corpses of the deceased, they are now haunting the house itself. It's mild in compared to what we're gonna get with this. This one's a lot, has anyone seen this? This one's a lot of fun. If you haven't seen it, it's an entertaining watch. This is a Tubi original movie that came out about 2 years ago. If you don't have Tubi, it's available for free. It's an awesome streaming service. I highly recommend it. And the entire premise of this is it's actually a sequel to Titanic 2. Yes, there is a Titanic sequel. So Titanic 2's entire premise is they recreate the ship. It goes on a similar maiden voyage and it crashes into an iceberg and all panic breaks loose. In Titanic 666, You know where we're going with this. It is the sequel to Titanic 2, so we now have Titanic 3. It is going on a memorial voyage in honor of the people who have died on Titanic. Perfect ideas all the way around, 100%, exactly, yes, perfect ideas. Great, nothing wrong can go. Oh, exactly. It's gonna get better. So we have Titanic 3, it's going on a memorial voyage, not to honor the dead from the first Titanic, but to honor the dead from Titanic 2. And that's pretty much the only reference that it ever makes to the sequel that it was. One of the passengers is very upset because they think that this entire voyage is sacrilegious and unsympathetic, which might be a meta commentary on the movie itself. She ends up using this sort of Necronomicon Book of the Dead to summon the dead. But instead of summoning the dead for Titanic 2, she summons the dead from the original Titanic, and it just turns into this bloodbath of social media influencers and celebrities being knocked off by former passengers. Yes. Everyone start adding things to your list of things to watch and read, because this is going to start getting weird, very weird. So we have ghosts, but shall we add something else into the mix? Sure. How many of you like The Walking Dead? You knew it was going to be, you knew it was going to come. It has to be zombies. You're going to see so much zombies. This is a rabbit hole. A rabbit hole. Oh my gosh. We'll start simple and we'll start going into some weird stuff. We're gonna talk about some very interesting stories. So one of them is Z-Deck. The entire premise of Z-Deck is you have a scientist who was hired by the German government to modify and mutate the bubonic plague to be used as a weapon of mass destruction. And halfway through this process, he suddenly gains a conscience and decides this is a horrible thing, and decides to take the serum with him and destroy it. But instead of just destroying it, we're going to take it on board a ship and travel to the United States. There's some logic. You're going to notice there's logic holes in a lot of these things, in essence. So he goes on board the ship, someone steals the serum from him, and all of a sudden the passengers start turning into zombies. And now he must join forces with Captain Smith, and they must fight the zombies and destroy the ship before it reaches the United States. About 7 years later, Richard Brown writes Titanic with zombies, which is kind of like a ripoff of this one. You have a third-class passenger who's boarding the ship. She's bitten by someone who then injects her with a syringe of mysterious serum. She goes on the ship, she dies quickly after that, and then her reanimated zombie corpse begins to eat third-class passengers. As the crew is trying to contain her, the outbreak starts to spread into second and first class and the other crew, and before we know it, the entire ship is full of zombies, and we have to wreck the ship into an iceberg to sink it to prevent zombies from infecting the United States.
That's unique.
That's unique. You lucked out. All right. If you like that one, let's talk about more. More zombies. Even more zombies. This one's actually a lot of fun. This one's written for kids, so take that into consideration. This is going to be, all of them are super silly, but this one's going to be extra silly. And the nice thing about this one is I'm going to utter something that has probably never been uttered in the course of English language. So this entire story revolves around the protagonist, who is a jujitsu fighting suffragette. It's fun, right? So the entire premise of this is we have an outbreak on board the ship. Elizabeth Harkins is a suffragette traveling to the United States to join their cause to get women the right to vote. And as the zombies start eating everybody, She teams up with a veteran from the Spanish-American War who has PTSD, and they must use jujitsu to fight off the zombies and destroy the ship before it reaches the United States. We know where this is going because it's the same premise. We have to strike the iceberg to sink it. This one's actually pretty interesting. I find this one really fascinating with what it does. So Titanic and the Dead actually plays off of an actual Titanic memoir. So second-class passenger Lawrence Beasley ended up writing his experiences with the sinking shortly after the event itself. And what this does is it plays off of the idea of the whole found memoir series. Did anyone ever watch the Blair Witch Project? That whole found documentary kind of thing? Just think about that with zombies and Titanic, in essence. So we have this memoir that Lawrence Beasley wrote, and the rough draft of this never goes to publication because in the rough draft, Lawrence Beasley says that the entire reason the ship sank was not because it struck an iceberg and everyone died, but because there was a zombie outbreak on board and we needed to deliberately sink the ship to kill off all the zombies. If that's possible, sure. We'll go with it, right? We've already surrendered to jujitsu fighting suffragists. Why don't we just go with this too? Yes, exactly. So the entire premise of this is the rough draft is the truth of what happened. There is a government conspiracy which forced Lawrence Beasley to alter his draft and say that it was an iceberg that sank the ship. And now we have the found memoir in this process. You want more zombies? Sure. Because one wasn't enough, two wasn't enough, neither was three or four. Thankfully not yet. Unless, I don't know, do I have any creative writers? We're thinking about it. Okay, we're thinking about this. All right, let's do one more zombie, and then let's talk about vampires, because let's throw this into the mix in this process as well, too. Just like the last one that we talked about, this one's actually pretty unique in the way that it deals with the tragedy itself. So this is a mock monogram. Since we're on a college campus, let's talk about what a monogram is. Monograms are those really dense academic texts that you usually have to read for classes that are written by scholars that are usually focused on specific types of research. So what this is a mock version of this. This was written supposedly by Dr. Jennifer Adams, and this is her attempts to locate the sunk research vessel Argonaut. And as she's conducting her research, she slowly starts to uncover all of this information about a government conspiracy, viruses, and its relation to Titanic itself. I'm not going to give you spoilers on this one because this one's actually pretty good. You know? I'm gonna make you read that one. Okay, let's move on to vampires though. All right. So let's talk about Matt Forbeck's Carpathia. So what you're gonna see with a lot of these vampire pieces is many of them harken back to Bram Stoker's Dracula. We're gonna keep going back to whether they're characters, themes, or sequels. So this one ends up involving three friends. We have Quincy Harker, Abe Homewood, and Lucy Seward, which if we've read Bram Stoker's Dracula, do these names sound super familiar? Absolutely. They are the children of our main characters in Bram Stoker's Dracula. And they're traveling aboard Titanic on vacation. They manage to survive the sinking, and they make it onto Carpathia, which is the rescue ship. Little do they know that Carpathia is also carrying vampires in its cargo hold. And now the descendants of people like Jonathan Harker are now having to battle Dracula's new brood of vampires. And it pretty much parallels what's going on in the story itself. More vampires. Okay. We'll talk about bloodlust, and then we'll delve into reason that quite a few of you are here, which is our book club reading. So we'll talk about Unsinkable Vampire. So Bloodlust is sort of an unofficial sequel of Bram Stoker's Dracula. This involves Mina Harker, who, if we've ever read Bram Stoker's Dracula, who's Mina? She's Jonathan Harker's fiance, and what does Dracula end up doing to her? Turns her into a vampire, yes. So it involves Mina Harker. She has separated from Dracula and is now living in London, and she terrorizes London, finding victims, and eventually a sort of vampire hunter-esque individual starts to hunt her down. She decides that she needs to flee London and find new blood elsewhere, so she books passage on board Titanic, and blood and mayhem ensues on board the ship. And the last one we're going to talk about is Kristin King's Unsinkable Vampire, which was our book reading list for the month of April. So, how many of you read it? You of you did. Okay, excellent. All right. Thank you, Tony. Okay. Basic premise of this is you have a daughter and a mother. They have lost their father. They have lost the family's estate. And the mother has booked passage on board Titanic as a means to pimp her daughter out to find a suitable husband. If this sounds like the plot to James Cameron's film, you're not wrong. So she ends up meeting Dr. Henry Beckwith and instantly falls in love with him despite his dark, brooding nature and his collection of sarcophagi that are in the cargo hold. I don't know. Carries it around with him. They're my souvenirs. So she falls in love with him despite his brooding nature. He does end up being a vampire, and he turns her into a vampire. Spoiler alert, I already warned you. Okay, so now that we've kind of had a little bit of fun with this, let's talk about the sort of nature of it in essence. So at the beginning of this, I told you one of the reasons that I enjoy studying the Titanic is the mythos that is involved in Titanic itself. So let's talk about narrative theory first, and then we'll delve into this idea of the representative character. So narrative theory is the study of how we as storytellers create stories and how stories themselves impact the audience. Narrative theory runs the gamut. We have everything from thematology, which looks at how different cultures interpret themes within works, to gynocriticism, which looks at how different genders tell stories. And one of the things that is part of narrative theory has to do with the representative character. So the representative character is a little bit different than our archetype. Our archetypes are usually fixed things, the wise sage, the noble hero. Our representative characters are different in this process. So what happens with the representative character is they begin as actual people. And whether in their lifetime or after their death, they begin to embody symbols. I've put 4 representative characters up here on the board. Did all 4 of these individuals live at some point? Yes. Have all 4 of these individuals kind of become divorced from them as human beings into symbolic icons?
Yeah.
Absolutely. What does the one over on the left usually symbolize? Yes, intelligence, math, genius in this process. How about the one next to him? Yes, freedom, civil rights.
Not adultery.
What about this one next to it? Are these pretty much the antithesis of each other? Absolutely. But what about this? What does she symbolize? I like that. Innocent sexuality. I like this. So what happens in storytelling is we as societies have a tendency to generate representative characters. We take people from our culture and we transform them into icons. And those icons become placeholders, stock characters that we use to represent certain things. If I make someone look like Albert Einstein, do I need to give a whole bunch of backstory behind those people? Or does that instantly code them for genius? If I make someone look like Marilyn Monroe, does that instantly code them for innocent sexuality. Yes, it does. So this is the beautiful thing about the archetype and the representative character is, although the archetype is fixed, the representative character mutates. We reinterpret these based off of what we as a society need during the storytelling process, which means our representative characters can change based off of the needs of society. And over the course of time, each of these can become completely different in their symbolism. We see this with Marilyn Monroe. What's slowly starting to happen in modern society with Marilyn Monroe's symbol? Why are we putting tattoos on her? Why are we making her look like rockabilly? What does that do to the symbol that is Marilyn Monroe? Yes, it modernizes her in this process. It makes her more relevant to our society. It makes her less innocent in this process as well, too, yes. But it's not just her that we do this to, and this scares the living hell out of me. It's this one, too. What is starting to happen to the symbolism surrounding this individual? Yes. It didn't really happen in this process. And so this is what separates the representative character from the archetype. The archetype never evolves. It will always be the wise sage. It will always be the noble hero. The representative character mutates based off of the needs of society itself. But the problem that I have with the representative character, and that some of the other scholars in narrative theory have with it, is we oftentimes limit the representative character to a person. Can a historic event be a representative character? Can an object be a representative character? Yes. Has Titanic become a representative character? Absolutely. And this is the thing that I love about studying Titanic, is it's not necessarily the ship herself that's fascinating. It's what we have done with that object that makes it far more fascinating. And we've seen this. We've laughed at these representations of literature, but what starts to happen when we divorce reality and transform it into an icon? You didn't think you were going to have to answer questions, did you?
The ship to be a representative character because there are no actual personality traits associated with it.
Yes, and it makes it less real, right? It dehumanizes the tragedy and makes it something that we can easily modify, in essence. And so individuals like Richard Howell talk about there are two Titanics. There is the actual Titanic itself, and there is the icon of Titanic, what we have transformed into a symbol. Other individuals like Stephen Bill say that there's also a third Titanic. James Cameron's Titanic has become its own separate entity. It has become its own canon in this process, to the point where it now has a parody musical that makes fun of the entire thing. So our representative character has a lot of weight. We change it, we mutate it. And as we've seen with a lot of these stories, the way that we shift between vampires and zombies feeds into the icon that is Titanic. Let's build off of representative characters and narrative theory a little bit more. And let's talk about horror, because we've been talking about the supernatural. So let's talk about horror, how horror feeds into this process. Check my time too. Okay. So child psychologist Dr. Lee Salk talks about how horror, haunted houses, and Halloween serve a very distinct role within society itself, not just for children, but for adults. It becomes a way for us as human beings to grapple with our fears and our mortality. We go to a haunted house because it becomes a safe place for us to grapple with death. We know that we are not going to get hurt, even though someone is chasing us with a chainsaw. Right? Unless you go to McKinney Manor. Has anyone ever read about McKinney Manor? What is wrong with McKinney Manor?
Don't listen to safe words when they tell you.
Exactly right. You sign the legal waivers at the very beginning of it, and they will do whatever they do to you. If they lock you in a coffin and bury you alive, if they cover you in pig's blood, yeah. There's a whole controversy with the McKinney Manor. If you're really curious, there's like this deep dive that you can go into. McKinney Manor is crazy. Yes. But for the rest of haunted houses and the rest of horror films and the rest of Halloween, psychologists like Salk talk about how it becomes a safe place for us to deal with our fears. You can face that monster and know that you can walk away safe. You can watch someone get harmed in a movie and know that you won't get harmed in this process. And so for horror, this becomes a way for us to explore our fears. But horror also functions other things as well, too. So let's go back to narrative theory, and let's talk about formula fiction. Harlequin romance novels, murder mysteries, horror, science fiction, and fantasy are usually labeled as formula fiction. They're cookie-cutter stories with stock characters and stock plots. In the case of a Harlequin romance novel, what is usually our cookie-cutter formula? Boy meets girl, they fight, they break up, they have to get back together, and if it's a Harlequin romance novel, there's probably usually sex involved in it as well, too. Yes. What about a horror film? Is there a formula to certain horror films?
Used to be if you had sex, then you were gonna die.
Yes, I'm glad that you brought that up, because let's talk about how this plays out. So narrative theorists talk about how a lot of time our formula fiction gets knocked. It's usually viewed as garbage, in essence. No one really takes a Harlequin romance novel seriously because it's usually just viewed as smut. No one really takes a horror film seriously because it's usually just viewed as violent gore. No one takes science fiction or fantasy seriously because it's just viewed as escapism. But individuals like John Coletti, Barbara Martinek, and J.O. Bartley talk about there's a power in formula fiction. Formula fiction uses stock plots and it uses stock characters. It uses those representative characters. So if we were using a stock plot and we're using a stock character, do we really have to spend a lot of time with character development? Do we instantly code people for hero? What are the boxes that we have to check to make sure that someone codes the hero? They have to be tall. What else? Dark and handsome, yes. Great.
Jawline.
Yes, they have to have good jawlines, yes. A 10-pack, not a 6-pack, a 10-pack, right? And they have to look like Henry Cavill. Yes.
They speak several languages.
Yes. What about villain? What types of boxes do we check to code someone for a villain? Opposite, right?
Skinny.
They're skinny.
Reality is not our, like,
Yes.
it's not a 10-pack.
It's not a 10-pack. They're usually physically disabled in some way, right? Whether they have a scar or they're missing a limb or they have a limp because it's supposed to mimic their mental disability in this process. They usually wear dark colors and all of that. So if we can instantly check boxes and say this person is the villain, do we really have to spend a lot of time in the storytelling process building characters?
Care why they're there.
Yes, we don't care. We don't need their backstory. If we have a stock plot, everyone knows the boy is going to meet the girl, they're going to break up, and eventually they're going to get back together. Do we really need to spend time developing these intricate stories? So what narrative theorists like John Coletti, Barbara Martinek, and J.O. Bartley says is there's a power in formula fiction. When you're not spending time developing characters, when you're not spending time developing plots, you can spend more time focusing on messages. And formula fiction becomes a way for us as a society to reinforce messages. I like that we brought up the yes, because let's talk about how this feeds into horror. Does horror kind of function to reinforce not only the societal consciousness, but social morals? Let's talk about slasher films, and let's talk about the people who die. Who typically dies in a slasher film? And it usually goes in a specific order. Yes. Yes, exactly. Usually the stoner. Usually we have the big breasted bimbo. Usually we have the dumb jock. Grandma that just Just randomly there for no reason. Yes. Yes, it's always the people of color, it's always minorities in this process, right? Whether they are African American, whether they're gay, whether they're whatever. Does this formula serve to reinforce societal norms? Why does the bimbo die? But there's one person that usually survives. And we have a name for her, right? Yes. Yes. She's the last girl. And what types of traits does she typically embody? She's innocent. What else? She's intelligent. What else?
Modest.
She's modest. Yes. Why? Why is modesty the big thing?
Was he usually on track?
Yes, they're foils to each other, right? Exactly. Does this reinforce a lot of societal norms? Does it reinforce a lot of gender norms in this process? The putting of women in different boxes. You are either the last girl or you're the bimbo, in essence. And so formula fiction serves this purpose. And so Coletti, Martinek, and Bartley talk about how there is a power in this storytelling process. We use these stock characters and these stock plots to reinforce themes. And just like a stock character, a representative character can be used in this process. We've been laughing at some of the plots for these novels, but there's actually some bigger themes in them. We talked a little bit about Edith Wharton's novel, or her short story. She's using the Titanic tragedy as a means to comment on the abuse of spiritualism, using people's beliefs and faith to use and abuse them. These comic books from the 1950s are using the representative character of Titanic to explore the idea of our fate, our mortality, and the ability and the fact that none of us is going to avoid death. Because whether you think you are or not, every single one of us in this room is going to die. Our zombies. What was one of the running themes that we kept seeing through many of these zombie stories? Were we dealing with truth? Were we dealing with government conspiracies? Lies. And lies on top of lies. And so this is what the representative character can do. It frees up space within the story to look at something bigger. And so while this might be silly and stupid, what they're doing is actually kind of interesting. They are taking this item, this historic event, they're using the iconography of it, and they're exploring bigger messages. We might be dealing with jujitsu fighting suffragettes, but at the end of the day, they kind of tackle some interesting things. Any questions?
Who teaches women to take in jujitsu fighting suffrage?
Yes, yes. Oh, we could go back to the whole last girl thing. Oh, we could do this entire Madonna whore thing. Don't get me started on this. Don't get me started on that. I can spend like an hour doing just a deconstruction of the Madonna whore. So. Oh yeah. Everyone knows what that is, right? Do you? So for those that don't, back in the 1990s, two psychologists, Crooks and Bauer, ended up proposing the idea that Western patriarchal society has the tendency to shove women into one of two boxes. There's the Madonna box and there's the Eve or the whore box. And when we're talking about Madonna, are we talking about the actress / model, yeah, the Vogue? who is usually actually Madonna?
Well, the best woman would be one who in public is a Madonna, but in the bedroom, not.
That's what men want, right? That's what most men want. And so Kurtz and Bowers talk about how what happens in this process is Madonnas are usually that perfection, the perfect wife, the perfect house, you know, everything. Modest, polite, soft-spoken, knows their place, doesn't challenge authority, whereas the Eve is usually independent, outspoken, doesn't want to...
Has sex with who she chooses,
Yes.
she chooses.
Yes, exactly. And so what Crooks and Bauer says is the problem with this is Is ever any woman fully a Madonna? Is any woman fully AE? All a mixture in this process. The other thing that Crooks and Bowers talks about as well too is this sets up a double standard. Because the same qualities that would get a woman put into Eve box are not the same qualities that would get a man put into Eve box. If a man is outspoken, if a man is popular, whether that's just popular or sexually popular, if he's independent, if he has a voice, we usually have a different name for him. Actually, we have a few names for him. He's the hero. That's the kind way of putting it. He's on, right? Yes. Usually we call them things like playboys, alpha males. We can throw Andrew Tate in this entire mess. Narcissistic. Yes.
Title.
Exactly. So yeah. So tearing down gender roles. All right. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. As far as like spiritual things, the most recent thing was Titanic 666. It's been quite quiet for the most part. One of the things that I haven't seen, which is fascinating, we actually, Hannah and I were talking about this, is I have yet to see a werewolf Titanic story. So there is no aliens. I have not seen that one either yet. All right. Hannah is putting a pin in that one. No one is allowed to take that one. Right. I think the only reason that we might not see a werewolf one has to do with the fact that Titanic sank during a new moon. So you need a full moon for a werewolf. That's not going to work out pretty well. It could be a hybrid. There you go. I like it. It could be a hybrid werewolf in this. There you go. I like it. Oops. My creative writing class is going to hate you tomorrow. I'd be like, I have prompts and you are going to write.
Not about aliens.
But not about aliens, because Hannah has put a pin in this. Exactly. But no, yeah, as far as like, that's the most recent one is the 666 one. I haven't seen anything past like, I think 2017, 16, so.
Are there like any others that you like? There's like one like glaring. I was like, something was like cosmic horror or like eldritch Lovecraftian stuff, which I figured would like very much be in like full Titanic though. It's very like early 20th century vibes, I guess.
I have not encountered a lot of that in my research, which is like you said, it's bizarre because this story is prime for that in essence. But all right, someone else has put their pin in it. Yes.
Lovecraftian part of it would usually happen after you're off the ship, right? Because it's in the depth, the thing that you discovered. Maybe that's why. Or 2040 when the zombies finally make it to shore. Water doesn't kill them. Like,
Start trademarking this right now. Start trademarking this.
that about like diadem. That ship, like, you know.
There's an entire mythology about there being a cursed mummy on board. You don't really see it weave itself into a lot of stories. Actually, she actually makes reference to it in this though. But like, there's a whole bunch of myths surrounding things like that. There's supposedly a cursed mummy, but that's all false. There were 4 crates of Egyptian artifacts Molly Brown was bringing back to donate to the Egyptian or to the Denver Museum of Natural History. But like, you don't really see that type of mythology with Titanic. And I don't know if it's because we're still kind of fresh. It's a little over 100 years. We still need kind of time for that to progress. But it would be interesting to see what happens in the next couple of decades if that starts to weave its way into the story. Absolutely. Keep your eyes out. Keep your eyes out. And I will keep my eyes out and I'll let you know if they do.
What about that show 18? Is it 1841 or 18? It's like a boat that people are trapped on and connected to other worlds. And
Oh,
1888. I think, like, while you were talking, it made me think that that was like no Titanic-ish.
there are certain things that are coded for Titanic, whether it's intentional or not. Like in 1929, they had Atlantic, which was a black and white film, come out, and they legally had to code for Titanic because White Star Line sued the production company and said, this is bad PR on our behalf. You don't mention that this is actually Titanic. So the entire story is Titanic's story, but it's a completely different name of the ship. So you're watching this going, yeah, I know what this is, and like stories like that are kind of coded that way. Like, but I think also as well too, it kind of goes back to like, if we were going to go to like the archetype thing, like,
So I'm perceiving it that way because I'm in a culture that's immersed with the archetypes of Titanic.
yeah. Because some of us might interpret it different ways. Some of us might interpret it as things like the river Styx and the ferrymen, and boats have always been kind of viewed as transitional objects in essence. No, you're fine. Ask away. I piqued your curiosity. It's a good thing.
Titanic, where class. Their horror film where it's flipped and rise up and like, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, yeah, like we're,
And
yeah.
use the text.
as a means to do that. You would think like this stuff, like the zombie one, would be primed for something like that, but it's not. I think most of these focus more on collaboration. So it doesn't really play with like Marxist roles. It more plays with the idea of everyone is the same and we all need to band together to survive. Yeah, it's no longer us. It becomes pretty much human versus zombie. So it kind of levels the playing field in essence. And it makes sense because I remember reading, someone had made the argument once that that's kind of one of the things with like H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, is we as a society will probably never reach an agreement with anything until we have to battle something else in essence. There's so much infighting with us between political parties, nations, religions, races, that until something else comes in and it becomes us versus them, we won't have that. Any other questions? No? All right. Sure.
Can you tell me when you actually became interested?
Ooh, I was 8 years old. So I was home during summer break and they had the 1953 Titanic starring Barbara Stanwyck, Clifton Webb, and a very, 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 very young Robert Wagner before he drowned his wife, Natalie Woods. I will stand behind that. I think he did that. So I was watching that and I was like, what is this? And I asked my parents, what is Titanic? And it was this big boat that sank a long time ago and all these people died. And I was transfixed by the whole thing in this process. And so,
The image
yeah,
of it,
the image of it.
and the way
Yeah.
it's being treated
Yeah.
already.
Yeah, that interests me. And then as I became older and more academic in nature, this is the stuff that really started fascinating me. Because you can spend so much time, we call them rivet counters in the community, like how many rivets are there, how many deck chairs are there, how many bolts were in each chair. I can't do that. I can't do that. But this was what was fascinating me, was what we transformed it into, in essence. Ew.
All right, don't forget, there's tons of food out there. Grab anything you'd like, and then if you want to stay for the book discussion, we'll hang around for just a little bit, grab some food, and then feel free to come back in. Thank you again, everyone, for coming. I hope you had fun. No nightmares about zombies tonight, right?
It's great fun.
Oh, thank you. And for our WebEx friends, we will just like mute for a little bit, and then we'll start recording the book club session. I'll be back. Thanks, everyone. Thanks,
Would you do with your sign, Arlene?
Yeah. Okay, so there's like no one on the stage, but this way, if you're on WebEx, oh, look, there's Tom. Professor Mattarocci in all his glory right there. So you can look at Professor Mattarocci's beautiful back of his head
Oh, Lord.
as we discuss The Unsinkable Vampire by Kristin King. So I know Professor Mattarocci has a lot of questions. I know Toby read it all the way through. I skimmed it. I think Billy read, did you read all of it?
Most of it.
Most of it? Okay, so overall impression.
Didn't like the verbiage.
Didn't like the verbiage. Okay, what do you mean?
It's like she's trying really hard to switch in the language that.
Trying to sound like old,
Yeah.
kind of, right? Like
Yeah,
as if back in the time, what people would sound like.
right, like it was put through a filter.
What'd you think, Toby?
Okay, like flower.
It's in a cheesy, a fancy, cringing way. Okay. Yeah, definitely. From the bit that I did read, it was definitely like, it kind of read as if it was like someone's, like diary back in the time, right? Like when they're describing like the doctor, like in these ways. What else did you guys think?
I feel like there was a lot of stuff, like open-ended.
Which we were talking about previously, like, it seems like it could have been like a much longer, because it's only like 59 pages, right? It's like a novella, but it seems like it could have been a full length, which then Professor Mattarocci and I got on a whole nother thing. We're talking about how so many books are like, seem so long and can be edited down for content. But in this case, it was like one of the ones where it felt like it could have been expanded upon. And I know Professor Mattarocci felt that way too. What were some of the unresolved things that you had questions about? Sarcophagus.
The ending.
And then there was like a chapter of like what was gonna be next in the series, but I think it's about like totally different characters, right?
Storyline.
I'm also using an empanada for our WebEx.
I would be interested to see what the other stories in this series are about. They focus on historical events like this and that, or they just are random spots about history.
Yeah, that's a good question. I should look it up and let's see, because I don't know if her other one that she had previewed was released or not. Let me look. And I will let you know too, I did contact the author. I like told her we were doing a book club and all of that kind of stuff. And I was hoping we'd hear, especially since she is a small publisher or a small author, but we did not hear any of that.
So,
Right. It's a bummer. So, okay, this is for. Yeah, all I'm seeing for her is The Unsinkable Vampire. So I don't know. Oh, but see, she does have, okay, she has pictures of the two other novels. There's Kane's Code and Death Taint. But I have no idea if those have actually come out.
what do we know about her? Is she from here? Is she
That's a good question.
this is what, Texas? Is that what it said in the back?
Yeah, I think she lives in Texas, married with 4 kids.
Doesn't she reference Colorado? Yeah,
She
Colorado
does.
Springs, right.
Which is an odd place to reference.
Of all places, Colorado Springs.
She hasn't posted on her pages since 2023.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's hard when you like follow small authors, you know? Yeah. Does she?
Because King's Code is published. She has Sandals for Christmas, a novella,
Okay.
and a couple of
Christmas.
nonfiction that ain't published.
Where did you find this information?
I just looked up, Kristin King, Unsinkable Vampire, then I put more by author.
Oh my gosh, Toby's a better librarian than I am. Faster than me. I was trying to stop her Facebook. Interesting. What's the most recent thing she's published?
Looks like it's. That's a good.
Why?
2020, or sorry, 2012.
So it looks like it handles for Christmas, a novella,
Candles for Christmas. Awesome. When was that?
2016. Just a little romance.
Okay. Okay, so the sarcophagi, let's see. With unresolved things. So at some point, it's the doctor, right, that has 2 sarcophagi.
Mhm.
And at least one of them we know has an old man
Yes.
Yeah.
that he's in charge of.
Yeah.
And then maybe at some point, a vampire pops out of the other sarcophagi?
Yeah, there's a female vampire
Uh-huh,
who attacked Charlotte,
uh-huh.
and I don't know about you, but they kept talking, like, the other dinner companions that talked about how this woman he left in Europe is great.
Oh, yes.
So I was like, is that her? And if that is, what happens to her? Because there's one scene that she's in, and then. So
They didn't really do much of the topic. I think they mentioned them and then just left.
he just left it, yeah. Because the last that we really hear of him, he's on the A-deck promenade, as the old man strapped to deck chairs, his Mickey Rap, that it makes no reference to the female vampire. Like,
Yeah, like the last thing is like leaving the boat. When they Charlotte, like, oh, I wonder what'll happen to the guy in this house. Like, that's it. And
that's
it's
it, right?
done.
Like, well, did you just dump him in the water and like.
Then what, 100 years later, it stops, right?
And then it jumps to 100 years later, because apparently, from what I managed to gather, like after he bites them, they go into like this like coma for like 99 or 98 years.
Yeah.
And then they're supposed to wake up, but it alludes that she doesn't wake up. Like he goes there expecting her to wake up, and she doesn't.
Yeah.
Just like,
Now what?
where's the rest of this? And who is this, what was her name? This is Henry Dutton?
Dutton, yeah.
Like,
Yeah, that,
where did she
like there's,
come from?
I feel like there's simple characters that were just like thrown in.
Right.
The other characters, but not flesh out at all.
And I was talking to him about that, and I was like, the whole dinner scene that she has with them, like, she kept alluding to it, and I don't know if I misread it, but, and I still can't remember the name of it. But like, there's the name, like the name that they give a vampire, like you have the vampire that turns everyone else into the vampire, and that they give them like matriarchal or matriarchal figure. But it seemed like that's where she was going. She was the one that turned him into a vampire. But I was like, but she never clarifies it. Yeah. I was like, it's just this random person that's like, hi, I know you, come to dinner with us, I'm gonna tease you like I've known you for 500 years. Did you turn him into it?
Mrs. Dutton knows Charlotte's mom. No, there's no interaction between them either.
There's no, she pops up, but neither is singing. It's like the first we hear of her is this random Molly Brown-esque figure that's just like, 2 young lovers, come with me.
Mhm, mhm.
Who's,
Were those the 2 main ones? I felt like there was one. Maybe that was the 2 most unresolved. What happened to the sarcophagi
how about the guy?
and the female vampire?
Yeah. He,
Oh, and was the female vampire the fiance?
was she?
Right.
Let me get that shit. There are some. I mean, I believe like, and I were talking about before the presentation, I think she went into it with a lot of grand ideas and it just didn't, I don't know if it just got away from her or. Yes.
Let's do this grand world that's been built already.
Right.
And then this is just something that's happening with some of the side characters in us.
We're not going
It's like, yeah.
Maybe that was the intention with the series and then take.
That's, okay, so are the characters the same characters throughout the books with different names of their vampires, right? They could be, it's totally different time periods. We have no way of knowing them. It's
Yeah.
obvious, it's not obvious, clear at all. Well, I contacted, I also just want to ask why the margins are so small. That's what I keep getting bothered about. Like, everything just seems so cramped. Did you feel like the voicing, even though you maybe didn't like it, did you feel like it was consistent throughout the whole book? Or did you feel like the voicing like flipped from like a more formal filter kind of thing into like more of the author's authentic voice?
Like it's more of a- it's out of it,
Okay. It's like it would probably be better just to go with your own voice instead of that, huh? It's very, I don't know, I think it's very hard to write historical novels, especially if it is in the first person because of that,
under research.
But how you use dialogue and how you use description don't have to be the same thing when you're talking about writing a story.
Like 2013.
That was how we felt, that she wanted the language that she used. That's what made it terrible.
That's a really good point.
No, that's what I tell the students in the creative writing is one of the problems that you have with voice is you try to make your prose sound exactly like the dialogue. People don't speak in prose.
In prose, right, right.
We're bumbling idiots. Like, your dialogue should be a cleaner version of human speech because it still has to be comprehensible, but it's not going to be grammatically sound. It's not going to be sentences. It's going to be textbook grammar book.
Grammar. And this definitely had that on top of that filter. That's a very good point.
But it's to play devil's advocate with that as well too. She is also dealing with historic time period and a class that did monitor their speech into exactly what they would say, because your utterances were a reflection of your intellect, status, side. So to play devil's advocate against that, her characters kind of didn't speak that way
Yeah.
because that class would have spoken
Open
that way.
This wasn't written for 13.
It's third person,
Yeah.
yeah, it's third person
Yeah.
omniscient narrative.
I feel like, what do you think about with movies when we don't have so much, like, we don't have, you know, details like explained to us, it's just shown to us. So the only time we do have that kind of voice is through the characters. I feel like then in movies, they have like a cleaner speech overall, or not really? I mean, it's just cooler. Down. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I feel like that probably feels, if it does have a very clean speech, it feels less clunky in a movie. If it's acted well, I guess, right, than it would in a book. There was also something at the end, this is totally different, but I just remembered when you said it took a ton of research. She goes into like, at the end, I liked how I read the back before I read the front, but I liked how she explained kind of like, here's the research I did, like, this is what I know that I didn't get right, this is what I didn't get right. I like that because a lot of times it feels like authors are very quick to be like, I did like my absolute best and like no criticism, you know what I mean?
I like warning like that almost.
Yeah.
I think in misery, like, I don't know anything about my, I asked the doctor, it's good now.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that too. I do wonder why they chose Colorado Springs. I'm trying to think of, I'm going all over the place. What's that? You guys kicking us out? Anything else? Did you overall, what star rating, if you're on Goodreads, out of 5, what would you give this? A 2.5?
Yeah, they
Yeah. How do you feel like it was like coming from a self-published, like small author? Was it like lower than your expectations? Oh, we're ending the meeting. As WebEx is going, you're good, it's okay. Thank you. What's that?
didn't really have any.
Didn't have any expectations going in. Do you feel like it was a good amount of cheese? Or too cheesy?
I think they're.
Too cheesy, okay. Why do you think that?
Like she tried.
Okay, so instead of embracing,
It was unintentional. I feel like it's worse than intentional. If we
Yeah.
were intentionally trying to make a book cheesy, then it oftentimes does come off as like a good, fun book.
No, I can see what you, yeah, like, it's, the Greeks used to call that pathos, where you were trying so hard to be serious, it plays as.
Yeah.
Mhm. And especially with the, like with the actual, like we're talking about the tone of voice and everything, that probably also makes it seem like she's trying really hard, right, to have this elevated speech and then,
Especially like very tough piece, like,
uh,
you know, like it's hard to make cheesy without. With. Hard to make it.
and Topi is also probably also a little disappointed, because Topi loves horror, and this is a little more romance, which is a little
Like
bit.
romance.
One other thing too, really quick, was just, Professor Mattarocci and I were talking about previously, like, why do you think there are so many, like we talked about, we did discover there's a couple werewolf and alien, but why do you think so many things surrounding the Titanic are like, you know, we have like the undead, right, or like the invincible, like the super old vampires, why do you think that's like surrounds the Titanic?
There's more fantastical than it was. It was this huge tragedy, but we didn't want to make it.
They wanna make sense of it.
The reality is everything about the majority. So, you know, what do? You see that can't die in a situation where
That's a good point. You put an undiable or unkillable
Yeah.
entity into a situation that's fatal. Well, cool. Okay. Well, thank you all for that. I hope you did enjoy it. I promise I will finish reading it. And thank you online as well. If you have any thoughts or anything about it, feel free to put them in the comments and give us a wave goodbye, Professor Mattarocci. You're still on camera.